Welcome to the What's Haunting You podcast, where we work on healing that which haunts us. With me, Micah. Hello. Welcome to season 2 of the What's Haunting You podcast. My break took a little longer than I anticipated. In November, I had a family health crisis that kind of remains ongoing, which means that I may not be able to post podcast episodes as regularly or frequently as I would like, but I'm going to do my best. I'm working on every other week for now with bonus episodes when I can. But if there's ever a lapse, it's because I've got family stuff happening in the background on top of a full-time job and everything. But I do really appreciate your patience through all this. So, what's been haunting you since November of 2025? I feel like a lot has happened since November before the holidays because it's February 2026 now. Other than the family distress I'm going through, love haunts me this time of year because it's February and it's that time where, even if you thought you could forget that Valentine's Day is the 14th, commercialism wouldn't let you. Although, to be fair, love has always haunted me in one way or another. I mean, my YouTube channel started by accident when I began to learn more and more about my own unhealthy love patterns, including the love addict pattern, and I wanted to share what I was learning as a way for me to grow and learn more, but maybe my journey would help others also. And it kind of did turn into that. But then I didn't want to talk about it as much anymore because I was so beyond it. But now I'm learning more about limerence, so I might talk about it again. Who knows? But it depends on what the audience wants to hear too. It's a little about me and a lot about you sometimes. Sometimes it's a lot about me and a little about you, just to be honest. Anyways, these next 2 episodes that I made, I want to explore the different forms of love because the English language really limits love and how we can view, practice, and experience it. I always said, and I think when I first did this series, I've improved upon it a little bit in this podcast. But if you go to my YouTube, you'll see videos from 2017 where I did this initially. And I use the analogy of people will say, I love tacos in the same sentence as I love you almost. But the love is different, I would think. So I want to talk about what different types of love, because sometimes we hold ourselves back talking about how much we love someone because we're so afraid it's going to be misinterpreted because of love being such a heavy word sometimes. I may delve deeper into some of these in some of these future episodes on different avenues of love, some of the things I bring up. It'll depend on what comes up from you, requests from followers, messages I get. Comments also help. But let me begin by telling you what got me interested in understanding the different forms of love outside of my own issues with attachment, which is a theory I'm going to address later, the attachment theory. So, when I was a sophomore in high school, there was a boy of the same age, we went to the same religion, that had a big crush on me. And this was around, it was high school age, so I think I was probably freshman or sophomore. He was the same age, and we had grown up together in the same very strict religion. So the options for us both were few. And I care about him, but saw him more as a brother because, again, we had grown up together for years. I have a younger brother too, so I'm familiar with the feeling of what it's like to have a younger brother. So, in my panic and fear, I was anxiously explaining this predicament that I had to my aunt because I was trying to figure out a way to tell him that I cared about him, but I wasn't in love with him. And she said to me, well, Micah, there are different types of love, right? You do know this? And different words for the different types. And I was like, what? My whole world blew open Back then, it was about 1990, 91, maybe 92. I don't know. But my aunt had a computer back then, which was really a big deal. I didn't. And she let me use it to research and type out all the different forms of love. And I actually did a printout from her computer on a pink colored piece of paper and put it in my scrapbook. And what I did with that, I don't know. I thought I still had it, but I can't find it. But anyway, um, I got to use actual books, which was cool, to research the different words, like the encyclopedia. I looked into the Bible, the concordance, the Septuagint, all these different types of books to research the different loves and everything I could do to get the most thorough explanation of the different forms of love. That's what I did. And then finally, I had all the different words locked and loaded to let this guy down easy and hopefully make him leave me alone in the romantic way. You know, I cared about him in a friend way, but yeah, did it work? Meh, not so much. The win, however, was that I began to realize a way to figure out and understand my own thoughts and feelings. And from that moment on, I would follow every curiosity I had when it came to the nuances and meanings of different words in the English language, as well as how other cultures use certain words in a much more concise way than I feel English does sometimes, in my opinion. So, as we move into the year of the fire horse, I'm thinking about how difficult it is to think about love, or even how hard it is to feel it for our fellow humans sometimes as we collectively feel the pain of the outgrown layers of the collective rotting flesh. That is the ending of the shedding of the skin of the rough snake year we had. But times like this is also when it's most important to remember and practice healthy love and understand what can throw us out of balance when it comes to love. And this is why I'm going to start with Philautia, which is what the Greeks recognized as self love. So again, I wrote about this and made videos back in 2017 on my website will be the original writings, which I'm not going to change. I'm just going to consider them archived. Um, I'm just updating them as I learn more and experience more. But Philautia was the last one that I had written about back then and that I spoke about in my YouTube videos. But I think it's important for me to start talking about it first. Um, I believe that it's really at the core of all forms of love. And I don't know that I really had consciously put that together when I initially made the videos. I'm also going to take a different approach to each word this time. Um, I want to include other cultures. I want to expand on how it shows up in real life. And I may do that more on my Substack for the sake of time here, because these podcasts sometimes can get lengthy. So I can go into more writings on my Substack. If you subscribe there, you can do that for free if you don't want to pay. And I'll post more content there. But I like to show when I can how these different things can show up in a healthy and unhealthy way in our mind, in our body, and our spirit. 'Cause sometimes our body tells us something's off before our brain catches up. Um, so I may get into that more in writings, or I can do a podcast on that. I don't know. We'll see. But in reference to Philautia, Aristotle said that all friendly feelings for others are an extension of a man's feelings for himself. Kind of reminds me of Jesus, who said to love others as you love yourself. Assuming everybody loved like he does, I guess. But that quote by Aristotle, it hits much more deeply for me now than it did when I first read it. It feels like we've lost our humanity away because we've lost our ability to care for others in a healthy way. But what is healthy Philautia? The Greeks saw healthy Philautia as having a healthy sense of pride without being too prideful. The idea of Philautia was also similar to the Buddhist idea of self-compassion. When we have self-compassion, we accept ourselves as we are and learn to feel comfortable being who we are. We're comfortable in our own skin. We learn to have a deep understanding of how to love and respect ourselves. Once we have a healthy relationship with ourselves, we then begin to learn how to have the capacity, strength, and courage to love others. We understand how to have healthy boundaries, and we know the difference between being vulnerable from a space of strength and empowerment and connection instead of being vulnerable from a space of weakness or victimhood. Um, to me, what pops into my brain when it comes to that is when people call themselves empaths. Usually, if you have any kind of trauma experience, especially developmental trauma, you are maybe your empathetic system is more heightened than other people. I think too, some people are just born with heightened empathic capabilities. Um, but I never did see that as a way to make myself a victim. I see a lot of people saying, I'm an empath and I don't know how to deal. You know, I just, I never really felt that way. I recognize where I'm more sensitive and I have healthy boundaries around that, but I also know how to manage my own energy. And I've just gotten better with that as I've gotten older, which is helpful. So finding tools helps you be vulnerable in a healthy space so that you know you're protected when you know how to protect yourself, right? Also, healthy Philautia, we hold ourselves more accountable. That would go into that also. I'm accountable for how I feel when I'm around people that may be giving off icky vibes according to my energetic system. But we hold ourselves accountable and practice loving discipline for our own sake and spend less time blaming and shaming ourselves or others. We're also able to take responsibility for our own well being. So that's what healthy philautia is like. The Greeks also recognized unhealthy or an imbalanced philautia. They saw it as being overly self obsessed, self focused, or narcissistic. This idea kind of crosses my mind whenever someone feels selfish for doing self care. Although it's admirable to hold yourself accountable um, and to be self reflective on how your choices can impact others, it's also not solely our responsibility for how others respond to those choices. So for me, being selfish is a bit of a sliding scale. One extreme of that scale is being overly altruistic to where you exhaust yourself or become codependent. I would say that would be an imbalanced yin. That's how that would show up. Feminine energy, yin energy. And that can apply to any gender, binary or non. We're talking only about energy here. If you wrap your identity up in other people and what you can quote unquote do for them, that's actually an unhealthy masculine energy because that's all about doing. And that's yang. That's when there's a yang imbalance in Chinese medicine. This also can lead to unhealthy martyrdom, um, always sacrificing for others, which is especially unhealthy when either you've been manipulated into believing that that's necessary in order to feel loved and you don't recognize you've adopted this toxic pattern, or you actively use your quote unquote good deeds to manipulate others and how they feel. And sometimes we do that inadvertently. We might not be doing it in a malicious way, but it is possible, and other people may see it that way for them. So we can't get defensive if they point that out, right? The other extreme is not caring about others at all. We can say that I don't care what anybody thinks, or I don't care what people think. But ultimately, when we love other people, even if it's just one person, it matters to us how our behavior and choices impact them. So this extreme almost is like the other side of the same coin as the overly selfless extreme. They both have an agenda that's self-serving, whether the person is aware of it or not. Now, this agenda that's self-serving may be again, based on a past trauma response or some pattern that needed to be adapted in order to make us feel safe. But is it still appropriate in the certain situations we're in now, or in the relationships that we're in now, or contextually speaking, maybe it's appropriate with certain family members, but not at work? You get my meaning? Not that we're supposed to be overly personal at work, but you see what my point. A more balanced approach of being selfish, in my opinion, is pausing and reflecting on your own patterns and what's motivating them. Doing your own shadow work, as discussed last season, obviously with professional help if it's really impacting your everyday life. Um, but you can go to I have a two-part series in season 1 on working on the shadow, um, for more on that. Then exercising boundaries for your own sake is another important thing. Being selfish means, and it may mean, just making time for self-care when usually you're busy doing things for other people. And it's your responsibility to, say, run a household or work full time, or like a lot of women, including myself, both. But the true act of love for yourself and others is making time for deep inner work, filling your own cup, putting on your own oxygen mask so that when others truly need you, you are fully prepared to help without compromising too much of yourself in the process. And also, not giving your power away to someone else and expecting them to fill your cup for you. Your identity and your self worth isn't tied up in others, but you're learning how to navigate your inner landscape and tend to your own inner child and your own unmet needs that often stem and are rooted from childhood anyway. This can empower you and strengthen you, and you're leading by example what life can be like when you do the work of inner care. So I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but Chetan Bhagat, I think is how you say it. Maybe I'm sure I butchered that. But he has a quote that says, or is it she? I don't know. Be so busy improving yourself that you have no time to criticize others. Which also reminds me of the Bible verse, Matthew 7:3-5. And I will read that. I forgot which version this is from. I'm sorry. I think it's the new, I don't remember. Anyway, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So, in other words, we can't help someone else see their way until we've seen ours and done our work. So, when we're in balance, self care is holy work. It can be. God is love, after all. So, that takes us to the Greek word agape, which is based on the concept of universal and unconditional love. Agape is an altruistic life. When you're living in agape, you have an altruistic life that comes from a space of compassion, kindness, tenderness, and charitable giving. In ancient Greek, they used agapao, Agapao, meaning to have regard for or be contented with. Agape recognizes that regardless of a person's foundational belief system, there is an energetic force that connects all things. And with that understanding, there is an allowing of love to flow through you without any need for reciprocation. A lot of times people will say, do something kind without needing to take a picture or record it. That is agape. Can you do kind things and take a picture in order to motivate other people to do it? Sure. But it's also a tad bit self serving unless you're actually working for a company who does that sort of thing. Maybe. I think that ultimately you know you best and you know why you're doing it. um, does it make you feel good and that's enough? Then that's probably the right. You're probably doing it the right way. Agape is also not exclusive to any one religion. In fact, being interested in other people's cultures, beliefs, views, and life experiences, knowing you aren't obligated to abandon your own, is an act of agape. I recently listened to an episode of one of my favorite podcasts, Lore. Um, it had a lovely real world example of agape love in action. It was a podcast episode about some of the legends around the Titanic. The specific example that moved me the most were the last words of Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Gracie IV after having survived the tragedy of the Titanic sinking, only to die not long afterwards because his health was never the same after being in those cold waters. I'm not going to spoil it for you because there's no podcaster I've listened to yet can surprise you with a twist ending and just land it eloquently and beautifully like Aaron Mahnke does on his Lore podcast. But it's episode 299 titled Unsinkable. I highly recommend it. It's very moving and very interesting. But if you want to hear agape in a Titanic sense, that's a good episode for you. Um, but I would like to share a few examples of the concept of agape in different ideologies, as it gives a more nuanced view than just Christianity. But let's start with Christianity, since that is my first thought, because that's how I was raised. In Christianity, agape is considered the highest form of selfless, sacrificial, and unconditional love that originates from God and can be exercised through Christ's example in his own sacrifice. Love is the energetic force that connects all things. Excuse me. There's a scripture in 1 John 4:8. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. 1 John 4:16 says, and so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. Since agape is a Greek word, the concept was found in Hebrew ideals such as ahava. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I apologize if I'm not. But agape would show up in the Greek scriptures, which is the second half of the Bible. And so we're going before that, during the Hebrew scriptures and the Torah. And ahava, from my understanding, and I'm okay with being corrected, please correct me if I'm wrong, but that's general love. And chesed, which is and I didn't say that correctly either, it's steadfast, covenantal loyalty and loving kindness. Chesed often used to refer to God's covenant with Israel. Now, in Buddhism, caring for others out of compassion is the motivating force behind existence. I'm not going to say this correctly either, but the Brahma Viharas, or four divine abodes, also known as the four immeasurables, are key Buddhist virtues and meditation practices aimed at cultivating boundless positive emotions to enhance mental well-being and social harmony. Those include Maitri, and again, apologies for not pronouncing these correctly, loving kindness, metta. The closest equivalent to agape is Maitri, a deep, non-possessive wish for all beings to be happy and free from suffering. Also, there's compassion, which is karune, I think, sympathetic joy, mudite, and equanimity, upeke. See, English is my only language, not just my first. Representing a balanced, ethical way of relating to all beings. That's what that is. In Hinduism, agape can be interpreted as the profound love and reverence exemplified by Atri and Anasuya, who admired the returning gods, symbolizing devotion and the sacred connection between divine beings and mortals. Agape in Hinduism is a state of being that fosters compassion and unity that is a reflection of divine love. Agape is also expressed through the heart-centered path, often through yoga, as bhakti, which is devotion. So heart-centered path yoga is bhakti with devotion. Also, there's the understanding that Brahman, the ultimate reality, is the embodiment of boundless love. Brahman is viewed as the source of the infinite, unconditional love that permeates the universe. This love transcends all personal attachment, along with a compassionate approach to not having any attachment to any particular outcome. This love exists in a no matter what sort of way towards all creation. Taoism, which is a kind of more the direction I have leaned as I've throughout my life after going to school and stuff. And it's because it's more of a philosophy than a religion, at least in the Western world. But Taoism understands the concept of agape as great love, an effortless, natural, transcendent, organic flow of compassion that demonstrates harmony with the Tao, Tao translates literally to the way or path. This kind of inexhaustible, see, I can't say English words well either. Love is considered essential to true wisdom. In modern interpretations of Confucianism, the concept of Boai, universal love, is a similar idea to agape, emphasizing compassion regardless of social standing. Ren is also a similar concept to agape, which but is more human-centered, beginning with the family, where agape in Christianity is more God-centered. Principles of agape also exist in Islam, often expressed through the concept of Rama. Rama is paramount, representing an all-encompassing, compassionate mercy, similar to the universal giving nature of agape. Sufi poets and scholars emphasize a passionate, selfless love for God that mirrors the self sacrificing nature of agape. Personally, when I consider this concept of a selfless love in relation to self love, Philautia, then it's easier for me to understand how difficult it could be for someone to care in a selfless way for others that was balanced and healthy without being overly self sacrificing if they had yet to learn how to first care for themselves to begin with. This can be difficult for those who have experienced trauma or abuse in their life. It can be especially difficult for those who've had trauma or abuse in their developmental years, including emotional distance or neglect. Which brings me to the third Greek word for love, storge. Storge to the Greeks referred to a strong familial love or attachment, a natural affection. The psychological attachment theory wasn't around in ancient times, so they used the word storge to refer to the natural affection you feel towards those you feel closest to. In ancient Greek, they used stergo, using it especially um, of the love of parents and children or a ruler and his subjects. This is the first love we learn as humans through what we now have grown to understand as the initial and most crucial period of life, the attachment period, or phase of life that lasts from birth, which is about 2 to 3 years old. Before expanding on how storge shows up in our lives as we mature, let me touch on attachment theory real quick, since I've brought it up and will likely reference it in more future podcasts and articles I write. Because when I first wrote about and did videos on storge in 2017, I had yet to piece together how attachment theory plays a role in this concept of love. In attachment theory, attachment can be defined as stated on the Simply Psychology site. I'm going to quote them. It is a deep and enduring emotional bond between two people in which each seeks closeness and feels more secure when in the presence of the attachment figure. So I will make sure references will be included when I post this on my Substack. You can look there. Um, I'll try to summarize attachment theory for the sake of time. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but before the psychiatrist John Bowlby came up with this theory, based on his own findings working with emotionally troubled children in the 1930s, there were theories from Sigmund Freud and other behaviorists that focus more on attachment through feeding. Refer to the cupboard love theory for more information on that. Bowlby challenged this view by demonstrating that attachment arises primarily from a need for comfort and security, not just physical nourishment. He witnessed profound separation anxiety in young children, even when their physical needs were being met. Through this lens, attachment emerged as an evolutionary concept because it demonstrated the need for survival when a person was too vulnerable to protect itself. So the infant and child knew it needed the constant presence of its caregiver. These studies underscored the significance of a child's relationship with their mother, shaping their social, emotional, and cognitive development. And this molded Bowlby's understanding of the connection between early separations from the mother and subsequent maladjustment, leading him to this theory. Again, this was the 1930s, so it was especially true that women played the primary role in the upbringing of the children. Basically, this theory hypothesizes that early caregiver relationships establish social, emotional, developmental foundations. Change Does remain possible, though. Thank you, neuroplasticity. Throughout a person's life, they develop other relationships with people during childhood. Um, well, as they develop throughout their life, they can correct any of the unhealthy attachments that the attachment theory supposes. But I'm going to talk about childhood biologically. Let's cover that real quick. The phases of development, because you can correct things, but the younger you are, the more permanent these neural pathways are, as I've discussed a million times. Um, so when you are the most important time for this attachment to be healthy with the primary caregiver would be from 0 to 2 to 3. But childhood, biologically speaking, is ages 0, depending on how early they begin to interact with peers, to 12 or 13. And this can begin to help shape how they attach to people also. Even if they have an unhealthy attachment with a caregiver, they can start to immediately begin to improve that depending on their relationships with others. Um, that 12 to 13 adolescence can range biologically. Then we move to adolescence from 10 to 24 years old, sometimes older. The brain's development can last up to the age of 32 and then adulthood. So I really wanted to state those ages out loud because I think it's really important to stress how much more maturing is happening in the human brain up to the age of 32 years old. So it's important to recognize how old children are biologically, actually children, and the fact that adolescence is now showing biologically to happen through the age of 24. It can, but the brain still continues to change and reshape itself by 32. And that is about the time when you were considered an adult in biblical days. Um, Fun fact, Jesus wasn't baptized until he was about 30 years old, even though he was perfect. He was a perfect man sent from heaven. This is Christianity speaking. He was the Messiah. He still waited until his brain was mature enough to make that commitment of baptism. This is something I ponder often. Since I brought Jesus up, this would be a good time to point out that Storge doesn't really appear in the Bible, but its antithesis does, which is the word astorgos, which is derived from storge and basically means having no natural affection. This is more theological, though, so I'll link that in show notes if you want to dive deeper into the Bible's view of astorgos. I want to mention here that so far, this all has me thinking about when you watch a documentary or listen to like a true crime story and they give you the background of a person that's done whatever terrible thing they did. Um, they explain the background of the person to help the audience see how the person may have been put on this path early on. They share it not as much for us to empathize with the criminal, but because the human brain likes reason, it needs patterns to understand things, and so does our nervous system to make us feel safe. Um, I think of Bailey Sarian every time she does her um, Murder Mystery Mondays, because I love watching those. She always has to explain the background, and she always adds the caveat of, I'm not making excuses for him, you know? And I know that's not why she's explaining it. I understand how the human brain works. It's just funny that people get triggered enough to where she has to repeat herself so many times. Anyway, it's kind of like slowing down to see a car accident, being a loop-de-loo person. Not as much about morbid curiosity, although that's there too, but it's also human nature to try to understand what happened for the sake of protecting our own mortality. But I think at some point, barring any actual physical difference in a person's brain, like a psychopath, for example, we all have a choice of which direction we want to take. We all have to be accountable for our own choices, our own actions, whether or not we get help when we know we need it, that sort of thing. We are all our own people that have to take responsibility for our own actions. And if we struggle with that, then we're responsible for getting the appropriate help we know we need so that we don't perpetuate the pain that was afflicted upon us. That's how I have seen my own life and my own path anyway, because I refuse to be the kind of person that hurt me. I refuse to give any perpetrator that power over me to change who in my heart I know I am. And I've crossed that line a few times. And I didn't like what I saw in myself because we're all capable. We have to acknowledge that's part of shadow work, what we're capable of, even in the darkest moments, and recognize that that's what we're capable of and then make a decision, right? I've done things that hurt people, and I look back and honestly, in a lot of situations, because of the abuse and trauma I was going through, I can't say that I would do anything differently because I still have no idea what other options I had. What I did was still nothing close to what I was being put through, and it was a means to get out alive, basically. But I did learn from the choices I made that may have hurt others inadvertently because I looked at what choices led me to that point to begin with. So my life doesn't get lost because of what someone's doing or has done to me. So looking for patterns can save us in so many ways, which is probably why it's a trauma response. That's my tangent. Anyway. Um, I think it's interesting that the Greeks very early on were acknowledging that there is a specific non-sexual type of love that's related to the attachment theory we understand now. To the Greeks, Storge may have been foundational in our attachment experience as we developed at an early age, but it was also demonstrated in other relationships, such as close companions, exceptionally close friends, even pet owners and their pets. Storge is a casual love based on shared memories and experiences. It's an underlying or foundational love driven by the desire to be compassionately caring for one another. Storge can form in relationships of a sexual nature, but sex isn't usually the initial focus of this type of love. This is the kind of love where friends become family in a sense due to their dedication to care over lengths of time. This is not to be confused with the last Greek word for love in this episode, which is philia. This is a good one to end this episode on because this was the version I used to try to explain away the boy with the crush. I loved him like a friend, philia. The other four are sexier. We'll get into those in the next episode. Anyway, philia means friendship or friendly affection, platonic love in ancient Greek. They used phileo in ancient Greece to have affection for. Philia is a loyal yet dispassionate love, at least in the lusty kind of passionate way, which, those are coming. Mm. Anyway, philia is a type of love said to be born of the mind. The opposite of philia is, can you guess? Phobia. In Aristotle's, I'm not going to say this correctly, Nicomachean ethics, Nicomachean ethics, philia is commonly translated as friendship or affection. Aristotle saw philia as noble and fine. The conceptual opposite of philia is phobia, which denotes fear or aversion. Phobia's root is actually phobos, meaning fear, aversion, or panic. In Greek mythology, Phobos was the son of Ares, who personified fear and panic, often depicted as a face that terrified enemies. This is one of my frustrations with English. How many times have you witnessed or have been the person that pauses before saying, I love you to someone you care about because you're afraid they'll misunderstand your intention, when usually this is what you mean? I appreciate you in my life and our connection. I'm really feeling it in this moment. I'm grateful for you. But the word love comes with all these different meanings and interpretations, making it so heavy. Anyway, some examples of philia would also be relationships like business relationships, friends, fellow soldiers, fellow travelers, fellow members of a religious or spiritual community, and so on. I would love to be corrected if my interpretation is incorrect, technically speaking, since I don't speak Greek, but in my mind, this is how I see the loves I've discussed today. To summarize, we're born and begin to immediately experience, or in a worst case scenario, long for Storge. We begin to socialize, begin to understand Storge a little better, but we begin to experience Philia. So those can be associated together. Like, let's say you have Philia and you get really attached to a certain person and you start growing up together with them. Then you have the Storge component. So actually, what I felt for my friend was Philia and Storge because he was like a brother to me. As we mature, the relationships we form based on Philia can also begin to feel more like Storge if the relationship lasts over time and remains a constant source of compassion and care. How these forms of love are experienced in our early life also influence how we see ourselves and how we develop Philautia. If we have the opportunity or privilege of doing so, because let's face it, if we don't experience a healthy attachment style early on, we will struggle to understand Philautia. We literally have no healthy model for what it means to us to experience healthy, safe, and secure love. So this in turn means that agape may be understood in concept, but difficult to practice if our own needs and sense of inner safety and security is compromised. And now you may be wondering, how does all of this impact romantic relationships? Or how do I understand the feelings in romantic relationships? Well, make sure you like, follow, or subscribe wherever you are watching or listening to this episode, because I'm going to get into that next. Um, I will have it released in a couple of weeks, probably the last week of February. But for now, I will link my Substack so you can find all my references and further explorations and writings of the haunting topic of love. I would love to thank you for watching and or listening, and I really appreciate your time today and your dedication to understand love better, because I think we all need a little help with that right now. Thank you to Jim Hesterman Photography for his help with audio and visual production. I have been your guide and host.